And welcome to the energy systems. What are the energy systems? The energy systems are the means in which the body utilises energy for exercise. And we have three. They are the ATP-PC system, the lactic acid system and the aerobic system. And we'll talk a bit about them in the next slide. Okay, as mentioned, the three energy systems of the body. Now you may come across different names for them. Names are interchangeable, that's fine. But for the purpose of our class, we're going to use the names ATP, PC, lactic acid and aerobic. Now, what do they mean? Number one, ATP-PC system. If we exercise high intensity for short durations of time, we pretty much use the ATP-PC system for the supply of energy to the body. We're looking at around about 5 to 15 seconds of maximal efforts. So commonly in gym or exercise environments or weight training environments, we use the ATP-PC system because it takes around maybe 15 seconds to perform a set of an exercise. In a sporting context, it'll be things like javelin, discus, Olympic weightlifting, those types of events. Next one is the lactic acid system. And this allows maybe 45 to 55 seconds, again of maximal efforts. That is, maximal efforts that you can sustain for that period of time. Commonly, the lactic acid system, track and field events such as the 400 metre run or a cycling event such as the 1K cycle or the 50 to 100 metre swim are commonly lactic acid activities. And we call it the lactic acid system because the byproduct of this system is in fact lactic acid. And that's a substance that makes your legs feel like jelly, you feel like you're going to be sick, you feel nauseous. And you only have two options once you reach the top end of this energy system. You either collapse from exhaustion or you stop from the discomfort. And the third system is what we call the aerobic system. Submaximal. And I'll put days because literally some people can exercise for days on end. And the aerobic system, if you have enough energy, is potentially limitless. And they are the three systems in which the body supplies energy for exercise participation. We can categorise these further actually. A further category we can utilise for the energy systems is aerobic, which literally means with oxygen, and anaerobic, which means without oxygen. Now, as you may be aware, the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system work together to supply oxygen from the environment to the working muscles of the body. And the working muscles of the body need oxygen for sustained exercise participation. However, if the need arises, we can exercise anaerobically without the supply of oxygen. That is, we can exercise for short durations at a high intensity without oxygen. And if we put the energy systems into categories, anaerobically, we use the ATP-PC system. That is, we utilise energy from this system without the supply of oxygen. And the lactic acid system also utilises energy for exercise participation without the supply of oxygen. However, as you're aware, these two combine 60 seconds and then you either collapse and stop, or what you also can do is reduce the intensity, allow oxygen to get to the working muscles, that is, allow time for the cardiovascular and respiratory system to get the oxygen from the atmosphere and deliver it to the working muscles so you can exercise for longer periods of time. And that is the aerobic system, or exercise with the presence of oxygen. Okay, let's look at each of these three systems individually and how they work. First system we're going to look at is the ATP-PC system. Now ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And we can also represent adenosine triphosphate as having 3 phosphate groups. The PC of ATP-PC is phosphorus creatine. And we can represent that such as creatine with a phosphate group. Now let's not get too caught up with names. I want to show you the basic process of what happens. Now from an evolutionary standpoint, we have stored ATP in our muscles ready to go for immediate action. What is ATP? It is the universal currency of energy of our body. That is, it doesn't matter if we use the ATP-PC system, the lactic acid system, or the aerobic system. Anytime we exercise, anytime we want to use energy, we need adenosine triphosphate for that. Where do we get it from? Comes from our diet. The macronutrients which contain calories or energy. Carbohydrates, protein, and fat. Now, as you're probably aware, alcohol is also a macronutrient. That is, it does contain calories used for the supply of energy. But we're going to look at the main ones. Carbohydrates, proteins and fats, which can be converted to form adenosine triphosphate or energy used for exercise participation. Now, we utilise the ATP-P system from an evolutionary standpoint. That is, we have stored adenosine triphosphate and stored creatine phosphorus in our muscles, ready for immediate action should the need arises. Now let's say in this classroom a lion or a tiger came through that front door, put all of our lives at risk, and we need to use immediate energy, high intensity efforts to get away from that threat or danger. We utilise stored ATP in our muscles that we have right now, ready for action. And what happens? High intensity, short duration, we break off one of the phosphate groups. We break that bond that holds them together. And as a result, this phosphate group becomes dislodged. The significance of that is the bonds that hold these phosphate groups together are high energy. Once you break them, a fantastic amount of energy is liberated, and we use that energy for exercise participation. Now we do have a limited supply of stored ATP, probably enough for 3 to 8 seconds of high intensity maximal effort anaerobically to get away from that threat or danger. Now the really good thing with creatine phosphate is that's also found in muscle tissue. It's also stored. You've probably heard of people doing creatine supplementation. Now what happens with creatine phosphate, it works as a reservoir or a backup supply of energy. And the way creatine phosphate works, same process, the high energy bond is broken. This phosphate group rejoins and therefore reforms ATP, and therefore we have another bond that is reformed that can be broken should the need arises for the release of further energy. The bonds are broken by a process called hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water, lysis meaning to break apart. So water is involved in the process of breaking off these phosphate groups and liberating this fantastic energy that we use for exercise. With our backup supply of creatine phosphate, that probably allows us another 3 to 8 seconds of sustained maximal exercise activity. Therefore, getting away from this lion or tiger, we've got maybe 16 seconds of maximal effort before to get away from the tiger, which utilises the ATP-PC system of energy supply. Okay, this is what happens. After 15 to 16 seconds, we can't get away. The lion or tiger is still chasing us. What we then do, we've utilised all our stored ATP in our muscles. We then need to go to another energy system, and that is the lactic acid system. If we want to continue at high intensity to get away from this threat, we need to go to the lactic acid system. Important things to consider with the lactic acid system. If we choose to continue exercising at a high intensity, what we're doing is we're exercising anaerobically because we're not allowing enough time for oxygen to get from the environment to our working muscles. The body will allow us to do this. However, this is what we call an oxygen debt, as in the previous example of ATP-PC. And we have to pay that oxygen either via exercising sub-maximally after a period of time or stopping at the end of the exercise session and breathing more deeply to try and get that extra oxygen. We're getting away from our threat. Lactic acid system combined with ATP-PC system gives us about 60 seconds of maximal efforts. Again, it is anaerobic. We're not allowing time for oxygen to get to the working muscles because we need an immediate supply right now. We still use ATP or adenosine triphosphate from the breaking down of carbohydrates and proteins especially, and also fats. And the byproduct of this process is what we call hydrogen protons. Now, hydrogen protons, if they increase in number, they increase the acidity of a substance. Drinking water that you buy from a shop may have somewhere between 1 to 7 hydrogen protons. Battery acid has 10 million. Now, hydrogen protons, through the processes of energy used anaerobically for 60 seconds, hydrogen protons build up in the muscles. And it forms a substance called lactic acid. And this is that terrible substance that makes you feel like your legs feel like lead. You're going to feel sick, you feel nauseous. You have basically two options. You either stop or you collapse. Stop from discomfort or collapse from extreme fatigue. These hydrogen protons accumulate to a certain level around the 60-second mark, and as mentioned, you either stop or collapse from the discomfort. What you could do, I've mentioned you've had two options, that is either stopping or collapsing. You do have a third option. You can reduce the exercise intensity down, start exercising sub-maximally, and that will allow sustained participation. And when we do that, that is known as the aerobic system. Sub-maximal, depending on your fitness level or depending on the sport or events that you do, could last for days. And it's aerobic. It's the only energy system that utilises oxygen to working muscles of the body. And when you're working with fitness industry clients, you'll be predominantly using the aerobic system. Now, the great thing about the aerobic system is that if we get rid of the lactic acid system, we've got hydrogen protons built up through maximal exercise at high intensity. We then change our energy system to the aerobic system, which literally adds oxygen to the equation. What we have hydrogen protons plus oxygen as the byproduct of exercise. The lactic acid system, the byproduct was hydrogen protons alone, increasing the acidity of a substance. Now we have oxygen, which can mix with hydrogen to form water. So now through the aerobic system, the byproduct of exercise is water as opposed to hydrogen protons. Now, I don't want you to get too concerned with all the chemistry and all the science of what we've spoken about. The bottom line is we want to exercise. That's our end product. Now, our dietary sources, which is carbohydrates, protein, and fat, allow us to get ATP. Depending on the exercise intensity and exercise volume, we either utilise that ATP through the ATP-PC system, the lactic acid system, or the aerobic system. And these systems all give us energy to undertake exercise to reach our goals. That is the bottom line, and that is the key fact that I want you to remember from this activity. Okay, Next we're going to talk about the training zone, the aerobic threshold, the anaerobic threshold, which form the training zone. This is to ensure that a minimum amount of exercise intensity is maintained to ensure continued exercise participation or to get a training effect. Okay. Here we have maximum and here we have minimum. This is in terms of exercise intensity. So maximum is almost complete exhaustion. You're exercising as hard as you can possibly exercise. Minimum is rest. That is, you're sitting down comfortably, you're not undertaking any exercise at all. For exercise to be effective, it has to breach a minimum threshold, which is what we call the aerobic threshold. So for us to get a training effect, we have to exercise above this aerobic threshold. If we're exercising below it, we are not exercising at a high enough intensity, therefore we're not getting a training effect. Now, how do we know we're in the aerobic threshold? A good measurement, a nice user-friendly measurement, is the talk test. That is, you talk to your clients, you ask them questions which require 1, 2 or 3 word responses. Ideally they can make those responses, but if they talk for a sentence or more, they're not exercising at a high enough intensity. That is, they're not exercising above the aerobic threshold. So the talk test means that your client should be able to speak in terms of answering 1 or 2, 3 word questions or 3 word answers, but not carry out a conversation. If that's the case, they're working above the aerobic threshold. The other end of the continuum, right up the top here, is what we call the anaerobic threshold. Also known as the onset of blood lactate accumulation, or when lactic acid starts to accumulate in our bodies and exercise becomes uncomfortable and hard to continue. We obviously want to work below that threshold because we want to sustain exercise participation. Between the anaerobic threshold and the aerobic threshold, this range in here, that is the training zone. That is where we want exercise participation or intensity of exercise participation to fall within. Above the aerobic threshold, so being able to talk but not carry on a conversation, and below the anaerobic threshold, so your clients aren't feeling discomfort or fatigue or nausea from the accumulation of hydrogen protons and therefore lactic acid. Okay, now one more thing I'll talk about in relation to this. This is talking about exercise intensity, is the FIT principle, which we have talked about in a previous class. As you know, F equals frequency, I equals intensity, type, or time. Now I did mention we may have spoken about it in a previous class. It has been covered previously. You may not have covered it just yet, but the FIT principle is the frequency of training, how many times per week you exercise, the intensity or how hard that is that you exercise, the type of exercise that you do, and the time that you do it for. Now the recommendations for health and well-being, and is what you should prescribe your clients, particularly for cardiovascular health and well-being, is around 3 sessions per week minimum. Intensity needs to be in this training zone, above the aerobic threshold and below the anaerobic threshold. Type, I'm going to put any mode, and what I mean by that is any form of exercise or aerobic exercise which falls into this training zone will improve your cardiovascular health and well-being. Rowers, steppers, bikes, rowing, all those types of modes are equally effective. And the time is suggested to be 20 to 30 minutes working in the training zone. Now, as you may be aware, you might have clients that can't sustain 20 minutes of continual exercise participation, and that's fine. What you want to try and achieve is that they get at least somewhere between 5 to 12 minutes initially in the training zone, so they're getting a training effect. If they're not exercising at that duration or in that zone, then they're not getting a training effect. They're not going to get a benefit from the time that they spend in their exercise sessions. So that's fine if they can only sustain 5 minutes. Obviously you're going to build up with progressive overload over time, but try to work towards 20 to 30 minutes of continual exercise in the training zone. Okay, exercise intensity. Now, exercise duration or volume of exercise sessions is easy to measure. All we need is a stopwatch to see how long the person exercises. But we also want to monitor how intense the exercise session is as well. And here we've got 4 different ways that we can measure exercise intensity. Number 1 is VO2 max. Not very user-friendly in a gym setting. And the reason why it's not is because to measure VO2 max, you need quite extravagant laboratory equipment, and it's quite hard to take those measurements during exercise participation. They're extravagant, large equipment that is very expensive and not practical in a commercial health and fitness centre to measure exercise intensity using VO2 max. However, I think it is important to mention it because you might come across a lot of research or a lot of literature excuse me, which refers to VO2 max. What is VO2 max? It is literally maximum oxygen consumption and your maximum fitness level. When we start exercising, our heart rate increases, our lungs expand and dilate, and we breathe more deeply, more regularly, because we're trying to get more oxygen in from the environment for exercise participation. Remember, our muscles need oxygen for sustained participation in exercise. VO2 max is the point at which we can no longer take in any more oxygen from the environment. Now I'll draw a graph which represents this. Here's oxygen consumption. Here's exercise intensity. Now we have pretty much a linear relationship. As intensity increases, oxygen consumption also increases. And we kind of increase like so. However, we do get to a point where we start to plateau off, around about this point here. What that means is exercise intensity has increased, that is, we are exercising harder, but our body can't get an increasing rate of oxygen from the environment. We've reached our maximum ability to consume oxygen for exercise. And we find not long after this, we stop from fatigue or collapse from fatigue because we've reached our maximum fitness level or our maximum aerobic ability. That is known as VO2 max. You may see in literature referring subjects to 60% VO2 max, which means that this represents 100%, this represents 0, 60% is obviously somewhere in the middle. Now this is a good point to make because if 10 out of 10 is 100% VO2 max and 0 out of 10 is 0% VO2 max from an exercising standpoint, then 60% is a score of about 6 out of 10. And that is a way to measure or estimate exercise intensity. Okay, the next one is maximum heart rate. And this is a little bit more user-friendly for fitness industry clients because we do have access to heart rate monitors, therefore we can monitor a person's heart rate response to exercise. Maximum heart rate is approximately 220 minus age is a person's maximum heart rate. So for a 20-year-old person, their maximum heart rate is around about 200 beats per minute. That is approximately how fast their heart could possibly beat in 1 minute, 200 times per minute. Now what we find with heart rate and exercise intensity, very similar to VO2 max, it's a linear relationship. Intensity, heart rate, it increases linearly. So that is, as exercise intensity increases, heart rate also increases accordingly. Then we get to the same point where we kind of plateau off for the 20-year-old male, around 200 beats per minute, and we find that this correlates to maximum VO2 max, maximum exercise or maximum aerobic fitness or maximum aerobic power, and the person can't exercise for much longer at that intensity once they've reached their maximum heart rate. And again, we can prescribe exercise intensity in a gym environment. We may have a 20-year-old male that we want to exercise at 75% max heart rate for 20 minutes. That way, 200 beats per minute is their maximum, 150 beats per minute is 75% of their maximum. If they have a heart rate monitor on their wrist, we can monitor their exercise intensity by using heart rate response. So this is a lot more user friendly because of the resources are a lot less involved than VO2 max. Okay, and the last one I'm going to talk about, we've already talked about the torque test, that is breaching the aerobic threshold. The last one's Borg scale, and this is probably my favourite one because it's so easy to use, requires no equipment, and it correlates very well as an accurate measure of exercise intensity. Borg scale. Perceived rate of exertion. PRE scale, perceived rate of exertion. So your clients are giving you feedback, subjective feedback of how hard they think they are working. Now, there's a few different models, but probably the most user-friendly is a score of 20 to 0. 20 meaning maximal possible effort, correlates to maximum heart rate, maximum VO2 max. 0 meaning rest, resting heart rate, resting VO2 max, sitting down comfortably. And what you do is ask your clients, when they're exercising, how they think they feel. Rate their exercise intensity from 0 to 20. Now, if your clients give you a score of 15, that correlates to 75% of maximum intensity. Correlates to 75% of max heart rate, 75% of VO2 max. And it works quite well. Very user friendly. All it requires is honest feedback from your client, and you can monitor exercise intensity very accurately without any equipment, as long as they're aware of this scale. Now, the other really good thing I like about this is, particularly for clients from 20 to sort of mid-30s, when they give you a score, you simply add a 0, and that's approximately their heart rate response, and it correlates quite accurately. Obviously, as we get older, because age is a factor of maximum heart rate, this doesn't work as well. But for clients 20 to early 30s, add a 0, and it gets an approximation of their heart rate response. Another good thing I like about this is that it's always accurate. Heart rate response can be sometimes inaccurate. I'll give you an example. Let's say we've got a 40-year-old client on blood pressure medication because they've got some cardiovascular ill health. Maximum heart rate, 220 minus age equals 180 beats per minute. Well, let's say we want to get them to work at, say, 135 beats per minute for a particular exercise session. We know it's just moderate to high in intensity. We're using heart rate response, we're getting them to exercise, and that's equivalent to approximately 75%. We're getting them to exercise and we're using Borg scale and we're using heart rate response. Now what we find is if they give us an honest response from Borg scale and they give us a score of 15, we can say great, they're working at approximately 75% of their maximum heart rate. That's the intensity that we want them to work at. But then we check their heart rate monitor and we find that it's not 135 beats per minute. It's actually something like 105 beats per minute. And we think to ourselves, I'm not sure if this person actually has a good understanding of Borg scale because we need to increase exercise intensity because they're not working at 75% of their max. That is, the score they're getting on their heart rate monitor does not correlate to Borg scale. Now the really good thing about Borg scale, as I mentioned, is that it's always accurate. Heart rate response, if somebody's on blood pressure medication, they won't have an accurate response because this medication is designed to reduce stress on the heart and stop it from beating as much or reduce the force of the contractions of the heart. Therefore, heart rate response is not very accurate. And we could make a really big mistake by saying you need to increase exercise intensity because judging by your heart rate, you aren't exercising at a high enough intensity. And that could have some catastrophic consequences. So in this example, Borg scale not only user friendly but really accurate as long as your clients understand the scale and give you honest feedback about the intensity that they're working at. Okay, before we go, just one point of revision. One of the main concepts that we've covered in today's class is the energy systems. Now we have done this already, but diet gives us carbohydrates, fats and proteins. These can be converted to ATP, which can be utilised by the body through the ATP-PC system, the lactic acid system, or the aerobic system, which all give us energy. And energy is what we need to exercise and achieve our health and well-being goals, or achieve your client's goals, which may be health and well-being, strength development, speed development, changing the body aesthetics. But this is basically the bottom line of how the energy systems work. Foods from our diets get converted to adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate can be utilised by 3 different systems of the body depending on exercise intensity. The anaerobic systems are for high intensity, short duration. The aerobic system is for longer duration, sub-maximal intensity. All of which provide energy that allow us to continue exercising to achieve our performance goals. Thank you for your time and good luck with your study.